Tonight, you're not just scrolling through another history story. You're standing at the edge of a dark village pool, close enough to hear the rope complain softly as it takes your weight. And the world is doing that quiet thing it does when it thinks nobody is watching. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a verdict get prepared like a ritual charge named Element Chosen, boundaries drawn with candles and psalms. You'll see how proof becomes a Schedule 3 measured steps with hot iron, or a single cold surrender to water. And you'll notice how one small detail, the third morning, the unwrapping of bandages, can decide whether a life stays put or is sent walking. Embers pulsing like sleepy eyes, wet stone breathing cold. A faint tang of smoke and iron in the air. Something nearby keeps time a small handbell, counting breaths between heartbeats, slow and obedient. And if your breathing starts to follow it, that's perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, maybe that little bell note will remember you there. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a dramatic judge pounding a table or a clever lawyer catching a liar. It begins with a priest blessing an ordinary element heat or death, like handing a key to God, and asking the world to wait until Tuesday to read the answer. You might not expect a medieval court to outsource a verdict to a pot of water and a piece of iron, but that is quietly what they did, and they did it with paperwork, careful timing, and a remarkable confidence in the opinion of burning objects. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let your shoulders drop a little. There's no rush. Tonight we're going to walk slowly through a legal world where evidence can mean how your hand looks on Tuesday, and where even the most dramatic idea is carried out in the calm, almost administrative mood of a village that has agreed on a schedule. Somewhere nearby, embers pulse like sleepy eyes. A rope creaks over a dark pool, not because it is threatening, but because ropes enjoy being ropes. A small handbell counts breaths between heartbeats, the way a patient clock might count raindrops. And just for a moment, you can imagine the feeling of standing in a crowded little space where everyone is trying to look serious, even the people who are obviously here because something interesting is happening and there aren't many interesting things on the calendar. Now to the beginning, the preparation. A judge names the charge in plain words because the charge has to be something ordinary enough to fit inside a sentence. Theft, a broken oath, a quarrel that grew legs and started walking around town. The priest names the element, which is an elegant way of saying someone points at either fire or water and tries to pretend this is a neutral choice. And the crowd names the story before it begins, because crowds always do. They carry rumors the way pockets carry lint. They've already decided what kind of person the accused is, and they've prepared little opinions like snacks. Choosing fire or water is not, in practice, like choosing a menu item. It's more like choosing which type of form you'd like to fill out, while someone watches you fill it out, while the form itself is on fire. Hot iron tends to be used for certain accusations, hot water for others, and cold water for its own peculiar category of logic. Sometimes the choice depends on local custom, sometimes on status, and sometimes on the season, as if winter itself has a legal personality and an opinion about boiling points. Even written custom, which sounds firm and solid, bends gently when a village decides it prefers one test over another, the way a household decides it prefers tea over coffee, and then insists it has always been that way. And the accused steps forward, not so much as a main character, but as a person who has been asked to stand an exact spot at an exact time. Breathe in 4, out 6. The body does not care if the reasoning is complicated. It cares that the air is steady. And in these moments, medieval law feels less like a grand system and more like choreography. The accused learns which language heaven is expected to speak today. The language of heat, the language of floating, the language of days counted on fingers. Then comes consecration, which is the part people forget when they imagine ordeals as spontaneous cruelty. The tools are washed in words first and in actual water second. A psalm gives edges to the hour, making time feel official. Candles mark a door, a path, and a boundary line where witnesses must stop pretending they are judges. That boundary matters. It is a quiet fence made of attention. You cross it with permission, and you cross it slowly. Someone will later say, with deep satisfaction, and the accused stood exactly there, as if the floor itself can testify. The priest fasts in some places because hunger has long been used as a badge of seriousness. The priest blesses heat or depth as if lending out a key. A chord is measured. A list of names is set aside. A small, tedious inventory of procedure is created so that doubt can be counted later, not shouted about. In a way, it's almost modern. It has the same feeling as a meeting where everyone agrees on the agenda, and then spends 90% of the meeting proving they have an agenda. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe. Or you can't. The medieval world would handle either option by writing down a note, sealing it with wax, and asking 3 respectable people to confirm you really meant it. And honestly, that sounds exhausting, so do whatever's easiest. Now we come to the tests themselves, spoken slowly, because everything in this world wants to be slow. The iron waits in coals until it glows the color of a hard answer nobody wants. Sometimes it is a bar. Sometimes it is shaped differently. Sometimes it is described with a simple phrase that makes it sound much less dramatic than it is, like the iron, as if it is the only iron in Europe, and it has been patiently waiting for its moment. The hand carries it 3 measured paces, or the accused lifts a ring from heated water, a ring that talks like rain on roofs when it drips. And then, instead of an immediate verdict, there is a pause, which is maybe the most medieval part. After the act, the burn is bound and wrapped under seals of wax and thread, so that eyes must wait. The wound becomes, briefly, a document. It is closed, time-stamped, made inaccessible, like a file in an archive. Everyone goes home with the peculiar comfort of knowing that something has been scheduled for later. The town sleeps, the accused sleeps if they can, and the verdict is not today. The verdict is a morning. Here's the quiet absurdity. The ordeal is not just about pain. It is about time. It is about the 3rd day. The world insists on the 3rd day, the way bakers insist on the right proofing time. If God approves, the flesh will quiet within 3 days. If not, the heat keeps speaking. Clerks and officials do not describe this as emotion. They describe it as observation, swelling, color, smell. The language is dry because dryness makes it sound like the universe is being impartial. Hot water has its own carefully measured dullness. A cauldron is filled, warmed, watched, and treated like an important guest. Someone might test the temperature in a way that looks confident, as if temperature is a polite thing that can be negotiated. The accused reaches in to retrieve something, and the act is framed as simple. Take the object, remove the hand, wrap the hand, seal the hand, return in 3 days. The horror, if we call it that, is processed into steps. Medieval Europe was very good at turning big feelings into small instructions. Cold water is stranger because it pretends to be gentle. A rope circles the waist, not fear. The knot remembers where truth should rest. The pool is blessed against trickery, then left alone to judge the weight of a single life, which is an enormous responsibility for a pool. The logic, in many traditions, is that pure water rejects the guilty, so floating is bad and sinking is good. Which means, in one of history's more awkward arrangements, acceptance by the world can look a lot like drowning, and rejection can look like survival. The rope exists to prevent the logic from completing itself. People say sink and float the way they say yes and no, as if the body is a ballot. The accused is lowered in, and the water does what water does, which is mostly not to care. That's the strange stillness of it. Water has no agenda. It moves around ankles without moral commentary. It reflects faces without choosing sides. And yet, in this small legal theater, it is asked to perform a decision. Hands that haul you out become witnesses twice over. They witness your return to breathing, and they witness what the water allegedly said. Someone somewhere will later claim the water spoke clearly. In reality, the water said, in its watery way, "I am water," and the humans did the interpretive dance around it. If you've ever watched people argue about what an email really meant, you already understand the trial by cold water. The email is the pool, the tone is the floating. Now, after fire and water have been performed, we enter the part with the most ink, the reading. Clerks watch for swelling, color, and smell with faces that give nothing away, which is a skill that would later be very useful for accountants and airport security staff. Bandages are opened on the third morning in light that catches no dust if it can help it. Everyone leans in, but nobody leans in too much, because leaning too much looks like preference. Healed clean means something like paid oath and peace. Angry flesh means fine, exile, or a harsher road. But notice the way the verdict is phrased. It is phrased as observation, not opinion, so God is spared from being quoted. It appears clean, someone says. It appears unclean. The universe is treated like a witness that has a bad memory, but excellent handwriting. There's also a quiet layer of discretion that hides under the holy language. The community is not always eager to burn or drown its own members, even when it likes the idea in theory. Sometimes the ordeal is chosen because it is expected to end in a certain way. Sometimes the social pressure is the real test. Will the accused submit? Will they confess? Will they settle? Will they flee? A system can look absolute and still operate like a negotiation conducted with very serious faces. And because medieval Europe loved options, there were substitutes. Oath helpers could appear instead of iron people who swear in tidy numbers that the accused is the kind of person who wouldn't do the thing. It's like character references, but louder and with more risk of damnation. 12 months can make a bridge, a single hand could not, because time itself can soften a dispute into something manageable. There are also champions, people who fight where wounds would fail, turning judgment into athletics with prayers at the corners, as if the ring is also an altar. Women, nobles, and clerics often had different routes through this maze, because law loves categories the way a sleepy librarian loves labeled shelves. A charter can move faster than fire. Alms can smooth a problem into silence. Letters can change what a community wants to do without ever mentioning guilt directly. And when both sides tire, settlement arrives as silver and silence, written small and folded twice, like a secret you choose to keep because the alternative is more work. In all of this, what counts as proof is not a single thing. Proof is a bundle. Proof is a ritual, a schedule, a reputation, a priest's blessing, a clerk's attention span, and a community's willingness to accept an outcome without reopening the argument at the market the next morning. You can feel the legal world shifting, even within the ordeal itself, towards something more administrative. Paper begins to compete with pain, and then slowly the priest steps back. This is not a dramatic exit with a slammed door. It is more like someone quietly declining future invitations. Councils restrict blessings. Kings prefer juries. Parchment learns to carry more weight than steam. The church's relationship with ordeals changes over time, and in many places clerical participation is limited. Because if the priest won't bless the water becomes just a pool again, and that is devastating for a pool's legal career. Ordeals then to border villages and stubborn lords, then to stories told by winterbred. The habit of letting elements decide becomes the habit of counting sworn words instead. A town keeps the cauldron for dyeing cloth. The pool forgets it was ever asked to be a judge. People say this is progress, which is what people say whenever something stops happening and a new kind of paperwork appears in its place. The legal imagination shifts toward juries who listen, toward judges who weigh testimony, toward procedures that can be repeated without heeding anything. This sounds cleaner, and it often is, but it is also its own form of ritual. Now the sacred object is not iron, but a written statement. Now the boundary line is not a candle, but a rule about what the court will hear. Now the third day is not bandage day, but a deadline. So, before sleep, keep facts in one jar, iron, rope, seals, third day. Keep suspicion in another, rumor, rank, season. Assume procedure is a kind of prayer, and prayers are often schedules with candles. Change one small belief tomorrow about mercy, about proof, about how fear looks in daylight if you feel like it. Or don't. Nobody will tie a rope around you to verify. For now, let the embers dim without needing to mean anything. Let the water settle into being only water. Let the bell sleep, counting nothing at all. And let judgment, for once, wait its turn quietly, somewhere off to the side, as if it has finally noticed that night is not a good time for decisions, and that the softest thing a court can do is close its ledger and leave the question unanswered for a little while longer. You might think a courtroom would want something calm and sensible, like a witness statement or at least a chair that doesn't wobble. But in parts of medieval Europe, a courtroom could also want a pot of water, a heated iron, and a priest with a very serious face who is about to bless an object that is, with great determination, trying to ruin everyone's afternoon. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the dark be soft around the edges. Tonight we're going to drift through the oddly methodical world of trial by ordeal, where justice sometimes arrives by schedule, and where proof can mean what your skin looks like after a polite waiting period. Somewhere in the background, embers pulse like they're breathing. A rope creaks over a dark pool, not to threaten you, but because ropes like to announce themselves when they bear responsibility. A handbell counts breaths between heartbeats in the way a sleepy clock counts raindrops. And then, very quietly, a whisper more curious than demanding. Where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer out loud. You can answer in your head, or let the question float, like a small leaf in water, not sinking and not needing to. The first thing to know is that an ordeal is rarely as spontaneous as it sounds. It is not usually someone waking up and saying, "Today feels like a good day to consult boiling water." It is arranged. It is announced. It is, in a strange way, filed. A judge names the charge and tries to make it sound tidy enough to fit into the day's business. Theft, a broken oath, a secret taking, a quarrel that grew legs and walked into the public square. The priest names the element, and the element gets treated like an official fire. Water capital letters implied, as if the universe is keeping minutes. Then comes the choice, which sounds like freedom, but often isn't. Hot iron might be considered suitable for certain kinds of accusations. Hot water for others. Cold water for its own particular logic that makes sense only if you squint at it through medieval theology. Local custom matters, and local custom is basically the medieval version of, well, we've always done it this way, said with great confidence and very little documentation. Status matters too, because medieval law loved categories the way a careful librarian loves labels. The season matters because winter changes what people are willing to do outdoors, and because even the most spiritual legal system still has to deal with cold hands. And the crowd, as always, names the story before it begins. The crowd is a soft, restless creature made of many mouths and one shared curiosity. It has already decided who looks guilty. It has already decided who looks innocent. It has brought those opinions along like snacks. Meanwhile, the accused steps forward, not with dramatic music, but with the simple awareness of being asked to stand in a particular spot at a particular time while everyone watches the exact angle of their feet. Breathe in 4, out 6. Medieval courts were, among other things, very interested in where bodies were placed, as if the floor itself could testify. Before anything touches fire or water, the ritual begins to make the whole thing feel official. Tools are washed in words first and water second, which is a bit like cleaning your kitchen by giving it a speech and then actually wiping the counter. Prayers are spoken. Candles mark boundaries, the door, the path, and the line where witnesses must stop pretending they are judges. That line matters more than you'd think. It's a quiet fence made of attention. People respect it because they respect the idea of procedure, and because the priest is watching, and because nobody wants to be the person remembered for stepping 6 inches too far into sacred space. The priest may fast because hunger is an ancient form of seriousness. The priest blesses heat or depth as if lending out a key. A chord is measured. A list of names is set aside. Details are gathered in advance, so doubt can be counted later rather than shouted about. There is often a clerk or someone who behaves like a clerk, ready to remember things in the dullest way possible. The dullness is the point. Dullness makes it feel like the universe is being impartial. And that is comforting in the same way it's comforting when a modern form has small boxes and clear fonts, even if you dislike what the form is for. Sometimes the preparations include small instructions that sound almost gentle. Stand here. Hold this. Walk a measured distance. Wait, do not touch. Do not speak. The ordeal is not just pain when it is pain. It is discipline. It is time. It is a community agreeing to act as if a process can squeeze truth out of the world, the way you squeeze water out of cloth. And then we reach the part that people remember, the part that makes history books inhale sharply and then speak very carefully. The iron waits in coals until it glows the color of a hard answer. It is often described in remarkably plain language. The iron, as if it is the only iron that matters. As if it has a resume. Sometimes the accused carries it a certain number of paces because medieval justice liked numbers. 3 steps, 9 steps. A distance long enough to feel deliberate and short enough to feel like it can be supervised. It's a bit like a very strict gym exercise, except your reward at the end is not improved fitness, but an official opinion about your soul. Hot water has its own measured behavior. A cauldron is filled, it is warmed, it is watched. It is treated like an important guest who needs to be at the correct temperature before anyone is allowed to begin. The accused might reach in to retrieve a stone or a ring or some object that has been placed there with the calm certainty of someone setting up a demonstration. The act is framed as simple. Take the object, remove the hand, wrap the hand, seal the wrap, go home, return later. It is almost administrative if you ignore the fact that it involves boiling water. Cold water is, in some ways, even stranger because it pretends to be calm. A rope is tied around the waist, not fear. A rope. The knot is practical. It remembers the length fixed to elbows, not because elbows are mystical, but because elbows are measurable without a ruler if you have a body nearby. The pool is blessed against trickery, which is sweet because water is famously difficult to trick. And then the accused is lowered in, and the pool is asked to judge the weight of a single life, which is a lot to ask of a pool that was hoping to spend the day being a pool. The logic often runs like this. Pure water rejects the guilty. So if you float, you are rejected, which is bad. If you sink, you're accepted, which is good. This arrangement leads to one of history's more uncomfortable bits of symbolism, where acceptance by the world looks a little like drowning and rejection looks a little like survival. The rope is what keeps theology from completing itself. People watch the surface like it's a document. They interpret the body the way people interpret the tone of an email, except wetter. And then here is the sleepy twist there is usually waiting. Not an instant verdict with trumpets, waiting. After hot iron or hot water, a burn is bound under seals of wax and thread, so prying eyes must wait. The wound becomes briefly a legal object. It is closed. It is time-stamped. It is protected from interference, as if truth is a shy creature that will flee if someone looks too closely before the proper day. Everybody goes home with the peculiar comfort of knowing the decision has been scheduled for later. Medieval Europe loved a later, it loved a third day. It loved the idea that time itself could do some of the work quietly while everyone slept. When the bandage is open, often on the third day, clerks and officials look for swelling, color, and smell with faces that give nothing away. This is a skill that would later serve many professions. Bandages are unwrapped in light that catches no dust if it can help it. Clean becomes a word with legal weight. Healed clean can mean peace, paid oath, restored standing. Angry flesh can mean fine, exile, or a harsher road. Notice the phrasing. The verdict is often framed as observation, not opinion, so God is spared from being quoted directly. It appears clean. It appears unclean. The universe, somehow, is both present and politely kept out of the minutes. There were also ways around the ordeal because medieval life, like modern life, contained a lot of quiet negotiation under loud ideals. Some communities preferred oath helpers, people who swear in tidy numbers that the accused is the kind of person who wouldn't do the thing. It's like character witnesses, but with more collective breathing and a larger spiritual stake. There were champions, too, where judgment became athletics with prayers at the corners, turning law into a kind of supervised exertion, which is oddly familiar if you've ever seen two adults decide to settle something by just trying it and seeing who's right, except here, trying can be a fight with sacred framing. Women, nobles, and clerics sometimes found other doors charters, alms, letters, settlements, because the law could be both stern and flexible, depending on who you were and how well your name sat in the community's mouth. Settlements arrive as silver and silence, written small and folded twice, like a secret you keep because dragging it into daylight would take too long. Sometimes the ordeal itself encourages settlement. People see the iron, they see the cauldron, they suddenly remember the soothing charm of compromise. And then, in the long, slow drift of centuries, the priest begins to step back, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet force of counsels and changing habits. In some places, church authorities restrict clerical involvement in ordeals, because if the priest won't bless the water becomes just a pool again, and a pool is not a legal authority no matter how deeply you stare into it. Kings and courts lean toward juries and testimony, toward procedures that can be repeated without heeding anything. Parchment learns to carry more weight than scheme. Paper becomes the new element. Ink replaces iron as the sacred thing people fear. Ordeals then to border regions, to stubborn lords, to stories repeated by winter bread and long evenings. The cauldron stays, but now it is for dyeing cloth. The pool stays, but now it is for washing and weather and reflections. People say this is progress, which is what people say whenever an old practice stops happening and a new kind of paperwork appears in its place. The habit of letting elements decide becomes the habit of counting sworn words, weighing testimony, arguing about procedure in a room that smells less like smoke and more like wax. And still, even as the official world changes, the logic of the ordeal lingers like a soft echo. People keep wanting the universe to answer them cleanly. People keep wanting guilt and innocence to behave like objects you can lift, measure, and set down. In a way, that desire never leaves. It just changes costumes. The pool turns into a document. The iron turns into a signature. The third day turns into a deadline. If you re still awake by the time we reach the third morning and the careful unwrapping of bandages, you can subscribe. Or you can't. Either way, no one will drag you to a cauldron to verify your sincerity. which is one of the small mercies of the present. For now, keep facts in one jar, iron, rope, wax seals. The third day, and keep legend in another, rumor, rank, season, and what the crowd insists it saw. Assume procedure is a kind of prayer, and prayers are often schedules with candles. Change one small belief tomorrow, if you feel like it, about mercy, about proof, about how fear looks in daylight when it is no longer dressed up as ritual. Or change nothing at all. The embers can dim without meaning. The water can settle into being only water. The bell can sleep counting no breaths and no verdicts, while judgment for once waits quietly somewhere, off to the side, as if it has finally noticed that night is not a good time for decisions, and that the softest thing a court can do is close its ledger and leave the question, resting unasked, unanswered for a little while longer. If you listen closely, the ordeal is less about the element and more about the choreography around it. The priest must believe enough to bless the water. The judge must believe enough to call it procedure. The clerks must believe enough to keep writing down names, dates, and decisions, as if ink has always been trustworthy. The accused must stand where directed, step when told, hold still when told. It is communal, not because it is gentle, but because it is public. Publicness is the medieval version of saying, "This is fair," and hoping everyone nods. Over time, the priest begins to step back, not loudly, not with a proclamation written in dramatic handwriting, just gradually, as church authorities in many places become less willing to bless ordeals, because blessing is endorsement, and endorsement is responsibility, and responsibility has always been unpopular once it becomes personal. Courts begin to lean toward testimony, juries, written procedure systems, where God can remain politely offstage, and humans can do the tiring work of deciding while pretending they didn't want to. And still, the human hunger for certainty doesn't disappear. We simply change the outfit. The third day becomes a deadline. The sealed bandage becomes a file. The priest's words become a stamp. The crowd becomes a comment section with fewer candles. We keep asking the world to speak clearly. We keep building rituals that let us say, "It wasn't me, it was the process," which is one of the most enduring prayers ever spoken, even when no one admits it as a prayer. So, for bedtime, keep your facts in one jar: the iron, the wax, the rope, the measured paces, the third morning light. Keep your softer things in another jar: rumor, rank, season, the crowd's confident storytelling. If you change anything tomorrow, change it gently. Maybe a small belief about proof, or a small belief about mercy, or a small belief about how often the world can actually be persuaded to answer neatly. For now, let the embers dim. Let the water settle into stillness without needing to mean anything. Let the bells stop counting and become, once again, only a bell. And if judgment has to wait its turn just for a little while, that's fine. It can sit quietly in the corner with the rope and the candle, patient, unimportant, and almost asleep. Just breathing slowly. You might not expect a legal system to depend on the mood of a kettle and the honesty of a knot, but medieval Europe sometimes did exactly that, with a straight face and a clean candle. Tonight we're going to drift through the trial by ordeal, the slow, procedural habit of asking fire and water to do what people were tired of doing themselves, decide. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the silence hold the walls up. Imagine embers with a steady pulse, a rope that complains quietly over a dark pool, and a handbell that counts breaths like it's keeping a tiny appointment book. And very softly, the old whispered question, where and at what time are you listening from? You can answer in your head, or you can let the question sit there unclaimed, like an unused seal. Before anyone touches iron or water, the ordeal begins as a careful arrangement of everyone's roles. The judge names the charge in the plain language of a person who has said theft and perjury more times than they said good morning. The priest names the element because the element must be introduced politely, as if fire and water are honored guests. And the crowd, which is always early and never subtle, names the story before it begins, usually with the confidence of people who have already decided how it ends and are only waiting for the props. The choice between fire and water wasn't always a philosophical decision. It was often local habit dressed up as cosmic preference. In one village, hot iron might be the standard solution for hidden theft, because hands are involved and symbolism likes to keep things simple. In another, the boiling cauldron is preferred because it provides an object, stone, ring, small piece of metal to retrieve, and objects make procedures feel official. Cold water sits in the background like a strange cousin, dramatic, memorable, and somehow always discussed in a tone that suggests the pool is doing everyone a favor. Even the calendar has a part to play. People in the Middle Ages loved a number when it came wrapped in meaning. 3 days, for example, is a number that gives everyone the sense that time is being respected, not just wasted. 9 paces sounds better than some distance. A chord measured to elbows feels precise without requiring mathematics, which is convenient because medieval measurement is often more intimate than accurate. Your body becomes the ruler, the community becomes the audience, and the outcome becomes something you can point at, like a bruise, like a clean bandage, like a surface of water behaving suspiciously like water. The consecration is a slow transformation of ordinary items into extremely serious items. Tools are washed in words first and water second, which is a charming order if you like symbols and an incomplete one if you like germs. A psalm edges the hour as if the air itself meets corners. Candles mark boundaries, the door, the path, the line where witnesses must stop pretending to be judges. A list of names is set aside so doubt can be counted later, which is also how modern people treat email chains, except with fewer candles and more passive-aggressive punctuation. If you are still awake by the time we get to the rope length and the candle lines, you can subscribe. Or don't. Medieval water never sent a follow-up reminder either. It simply waited quietly as if patience were a form of evidence. When the objects are ready, everyone rehearses seriousness. The priest may fast because hunger is a traditional way of looking official. The judge sits like a person who has been assigned dignity. The clerks prepare their ink with the cautious tenderness of people who know ink will stain anything except the truth. Even the accused is positioned carefully because the accused must be visible. Visibility is part of the ritual. It tells the crowd, yes, we are doing this together, which is both comforting and unsettling, depending on how much you enjoy being observed. Now the iron begins its slow promotion from metal to verdict. It waits and cools until it glows the color of a hard answer no one wants to request loudly. The community watches, and this watching is important because watching turns heat into something like consensus. Sometimes the task is to carry the iron a certain number of paces. Sometimes it is to hold it for a measured moment, and the measurement is not just measurement. It is a way of pretending the world is fair if we count correctly. The boiling cauldron is its own kind of ceremony. A pot that might normally make soup becomes a theological instrument, which is a strange career change for cookware. The accused reaches for a small object in the water stone, ring, small token because a retrieved object feels like proof you can hold. People prefer proof you can hold. Proof that can be held feels less like opinion and more like furniture. And furniture, in any century, is reassuring. Cold water, on the other hand, behaves like a public test of physics with an emotional dress code. A rope circles the waist, and the knot is checked with the care usually reserved for doors you can't afford to replace. The pool is blessed against trickery, which is sweet, because water is famously difficult to trick unless you happen to be a duck, in which case water is basically your resume. The accused is lowered or pushed in. depending on local temperament and how many people have had to stand in the same place for too long. Then everybody stares at the surface the way modern people stare at loading bars. They are waiting for the world to declare a result. In the logic of some ordeals, sinking is acceptance and floating is rejection, which is one of those ideas that becomes easier to understand only if you stop trying. The crowd hums with interpretations. The officials try to hold their faces in neutral positions. The water keeps doing water things, which is to say, it moves quietly and refuses to be emotionally helpful. After fire and boiling water, the real suspense, if we may call it that, very quietly arrives in the waiting. The injury is often bandaged, sealed, and tied so prying eyes must wait. Wax appears because wax looks final. Thread appears because thread looks careful. The hand is wrapped as if it were a letter, and the body becomes a little envelope addressed to the third day. The third day arrives, as third days do, without fanfare. Clerks and officials gather with faces that try very hard to look like faces. The bandage is opened in daylight that catches no dust if it can help it. They inspect swelling, color, smell extremely practical observations that no one would describe as magical if they were happening in a kitchen. Clean becomes a legal word. Unclean becomes a legal word. And the verdict is phrased like weather, observed, recorded, and politely blamed on something bigger than the people holding the bandage. This phrasing matters. When the verdict is described as observation rather than opinion, responsibility slides away smoothly, like a well-trained eel. Nobody has to say, I think. They can say, it is. And in a medieval setting, it is can be a kind of anesthetic. It dulls the sharpness of choosing. It turns judgment into a description. It lets everyone go home feeling like the universe did the paperwork. Not every dispute reached the point of a glowing iron. Medieval law had other, quieter exits. Oath helpers could appear, a carefully counted group of people willing to swear that someone as character is sturdy enough to stand on. It is like a character reference, except the character reference is standing in front of you, breathing in unison, and possibly wearing their best cloak. Sometimes there is compurgation, sometimes negotiated settlement, sometimes a fine that arrives like a tired sigh, not heroic, not dramatic, just paid and recorded and quietly remembered. There are also champions, and long before you imagine dramatic duels, it helps to remember how bureaucratic a fight can become. A duel, when it is treated as proof, requires permissions, rules, boundaries, and, ideally, someone measuring where everyone should stand. Even violence, when institutionalized, grows forms and footnotes. A combat can be framed as athletics with prayer at the corners, which is a very medieval way to make a harsh thing feel organized. And through all of this, the crowd stays present as a kind of witness that cannot be cross-examined. The crowd brings memory. The crowd brings gossip. The crowd brings the feeling that the community is watching itself, so the community must behave as if it has standards. Sometimes the crowd keeps people honest. Sometimes it keeps people frightened. Often it does both at once, in the same breath, without noticing. You might not expect an empire to run on splinters, but for a long time, England's money could be described very calmly as a story told by notches in wood, not symbolic wood, not metaphor wood. Real pieces of hazel or willow, handled by people with ink-stained fingers and very patient expressions, who trusted a stick the way modern people trust a password they made up at 1 a.m. and then immediately forgot. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air settle into its favorite shape. Imagine a quiet table, a small knife, a candle that doesn't feel the need to impress anyone, and a piece of wood that has agreed, reluctantly, to become an instrument of national finance. Listen for small sounds, the soft rasp of blade on grain, the private little sigh bark makes when it gives up, the almost comical dignity of paperwork happening in slow motion. And then, as a gentle habit, A whisper drifts by and asks, "Where and what time are you listening from?" The tally stick begins as something pleasantly ordinary. A clerk chooses a piece of wood that is straight enough to behave. Hazel is often mentioned because hazel splits in a nicely cooperative way, and cooperation is the first requirement of bureaucracy. The stick is trimmed to a manageable length, not too proud, not too shy. Then comes the knife, and the knife does what medieval and early modern knives did best: make little marks that pretend to be permanent. The notches are the whole point, and also, in an odd way, the whole comfort. A notch is a physical decision. It doesn't blur when someone is tired. It doesn't smudge if it rains. Different amounts are represented by different sizes and shapes of cuts, because humans enjoy turning numbers into textures. A small cut can stand for a small amount. A larger cut can stand for a larger amount. You can almost feel the system trying kindly to keep humans from arguing about handwriting. There's writing too, usually, because people cannot resist adding words, even after inventing a clever alternative to words. Names of parties, dates, a short description of what is owed and why, but the ink is almost a supporting actor. The notches do the heavy lifting, like a dependable colleague who never asks to be promoted and never forgets what you said in the meeting. And then the stick is split lengthwise, not snapped, not smashed. Split so it becomes two matching halves with the same pattern of grain, the same accidental quirks, the same little imperfections that no forger can easily invent on purpose. One half goes to one party and one half to the other. They can be reunited later, like two quiet siblings who only become interesting when you press them together and notice they fit. If you find yourself wondering why anyone would do this, you're already thinking like an administrator. The simple answer is trust. Or rather, does trust manage politely? If a debtor holds one half and the exchequer holds the other, the obligation has a physical anchor on both sides. It's hard to argue with wood that matches wood. It's an early, low-tech version of we both have the same file, except the file is a stick, and the stick is sometimes stored near something damp, fragrant, and probably not meant for accounting, but it survives anyway. This is a good moment early on to offer you a gentle, ridiculous invitation. If you were still awake by the time we get to the part where grown adults start carrying sticks as official financial instruments, you can subscribe. Or don't. The tally stick never begged for attention either. It simply sat there, quietly, being correct. Now the stick begins its second life, which is to wait. Waiting is one of history's favorite activities, and institutions are especially good at it. One half might travel in a pouch. One half might sit in a chest. One half might live in a corner that smells like wool and old smoke. The point is not speed. The point is the slow certainty that someday two halves will meet again, and the grain will line up like a seam you can trace with a fingertip. In the exchequer, an office name that sounds like it should come with a warm blanket, and a stern cup of tea, the government kept tallies with a seriousness that suggests it had never once enjoyed a spontaneous afternoon. Tallies could come in for taxes, rents, feudal dues, loans, and all the other small streams that add up into something that looks like a kingdom. And because the medieval and early modern state was not a single creature but a collection of rooms and habits, the stick system helped keep memory from dissolving into rumor and wishful thinking. There's something quietly funny about the way a tally stick turns a complicated human relationship into a simple physical puzzle. You owe, I am owed. We each hold a piece of the same object, and the object does not care about our feelings. It's hard to exaggerate convincingly to a stick. It sits there with the stubborn calm of a door frame. Of course, people still try. Humans remain human. Sticks could be lost, stolen, dampened, chewed by rodents with no respect for fiscal policy. Clerks could misspell a name, which is the most historically reliable way to create conflict without needing a sword. Someone could insist their half was the real half, in the way people insist things during arguments. When the main goal is to keep talking until the other person grows sleepy and agrees just to end the conversation. But the system's charm is that it doesn't rely on anyone being wise. It relies on matching. Matching is not a virtue, it is a geometry. The halves either meet cleanly or they don't. And in a world where signatures could be copied and wax could be faked and witnesses could be bribed, there is something soothing about a system that says very gently, please align the grain. Sometimes a tally is called in and examined in a way that feels almost tender. The halves are brought together. The notches align, the grain pattern agrees. The writing, if present, confirms what the wood already said. Satisfied officials make notes because officials are happiest when making notes about having made notes. There is closure, but not the kind that gives you chills. The kind that gives you a quiet nod and a return to sitting. And because this is an administrative world, there are procedures around procedures. Tallies have to be stored, counted, and retrieved. Storage itself becomes a small philosophy. Too accessible and someone can tamper. Too hidden and nothing can be found, which is a tragic fate for a system built to remember. So the tallies are kept in chests and compartments, sometimes organized by category, sometimes by the most human category of all, where we put it last time. If you've ever opened a drawer and found 3 different chargers living together like confused eels, you understand the spirit perfectly. The exchequer just did it with revenue and with fewer plastics and more resignation. Now, without rushing, let's drift into the movement of tallies through the world. Because the tally stick isn't merely an internal memory, it travels. It goes from manor to town, from town to office, from office to storage. It becomes a token that can be held, produced, compared, and occasionally transferred, because a physical claim can be treated like a small commodity. You can almost hear the gentle clack of bureaucracy as it passes from hand to hand. In some periods, tallies were not just records. They could function a bit like credit instruments because the government's promise encoded in wood had a kind of weight. Not the romantic weight of gold. The dull, dependable weight of the state will probably still exist next year. Historically, that has been a strong selling point and also a slightly haunting one. The people involved form an entire cast of quiet professionals. Clerks who can read and write, which already makes them a sort of everyday miracle with a wage. Sheriffs and local officials who gather money in the slowest way possible, one household at a time, like collecting small coins for a very large and tired piggy bank. Messengers who carry documents and, yes, sticks. And above them all, administrators who believe in procedure the way other people believe in weather. You can to control it, but you can at least plan around it and pretend that's the same thing. When tallies came in, there might be auditing rituals. Amounts read aloud, notes compared, seals checked, identities verified. The language could be formal, but the mood was often simply weary. Reconciliation has never been glamorous. Reconciliation is mostly the sound of paper being turned and someone clearing their throat and pretending they did not yawn. Even the furniture matters. The exchequer is associated with a checkered cloth laid on a table, used for arranging and counting. Humans love grids. Grids make quantities feel tame. A checkered pattern turns money into something that can be set down politely in squares, like an obedient game. It's also, if you squint, a kind of medieval spreadsheet embroidered, reusable, and quietly judgmental. You could imagine the end of such a day. Candles guttering, a clerk rubbing ink from the side of his thumb, a tally stick laid down with care, as if it might roll away and start a new career. And somewhere outside, ordinary life continuing, unaware that its obligations have been translated into woodcuts and stored like winter apples, waiting for the next season of accounting. Now we can drift softly to the gentle absurdity of how old systems end. Not with speeches, usually, with storage problems. With reforms. With a committee deciding in a room that they would prefer a different kind of headache. Over time, paper grows more dominant. Accounting practices shift. Ledgers become the main stage, and sticks become a background habit, then a quaint habit, then a habit that makes newer clerks raise their eyebrows in the way young people raise their eyebrows at fax machines. We did what with wood, they might think, while carefully not saying it too loudly in case the old system hears and feels insulted. But tallies do not vanish instantly. That's not how archives work. Old tallies linger. They sit in bundles. They accumulate because institutions are excellent at keeping things just in case, and just in case is a powerful spell. The bundles become historical sediment, quiet layers of finished business that still take up space and still make a faint, dry sound when you shift them. Eventually, someone has to decide what to do with piles of obsolete wooden records. This is where history offers one of its most softly ironic moments. Sometimes the most dangerous part of governance is not invasion, not rebellion, not even scandal. Sometimes it is housekeeping. In the 1830s in Britain, old exchequer tally sticks were ordered to be disposed of. The chosen method was, essentially, to burn them, which sounds simple, like roasting chestnuts, until you remember the volume of wood and the stubborn enthusiasm of fire. The burning went badly, and it contributed to the famous fire at the Palace of Westminster in 1834. It is one of those events that feels like a moral fable written by an archivist. Postpone your filing long enough, and your filing may file you. It's hard not to smile quietly at that. A system designed to prevent fraud ends, in part, by accidentally setting a very important building on fire. Bureaucracy rarely gets to be dramatic. When it does, it's usually by mistake, and usually after someone said confidently, "This will be fine." Still, even in this, the mood can remain oddly gentle if you stand back far enough. Fire eats paper and wood without caring what they represent. Flames do not respect receipts. Smoke does not verify signatures. The tallies, once so serious, become ash, and ash is the most impartial accounting medium of all. And yet, the idea behind the tally survives, as ideas often do. Shared records, matched counterparts, redundancy that makes convenient lying less convenient. We just transfer the habit into new materials. We split information into copies, we compare, we reconcile, we sigh. We trust a system because it is annoying to fake and because it is, in its own sleepy way, consistent. So for bedtime, keep your facts in one quiet jar. The hazel stick, the notches, the split halves, the checkered cloth, the bundles resting in storage. Keep your softer thoughts in another jar. The patience of clerks, the slow travel of a record through a kingdom, the comforting stubbornness of a piece of wood that matches its twin. If you want, make one small promise for tomorrow that you do not have to keep perfectly. Label one folder, put one small thing back where it belongs, and let it be enough. And now let the candle lower itself toward calm. Let the knife stop scraping. Let the stick rest, not as money, not as proof, just as wood, again quiet and grainy, and completely unimpressed by human worry. The room goes still. The checkered cloth folds. The ledger closes with a soft, defeated sound. And the whole kingdom of numbers, for the moment, decides it can wait until morning. After the iron has been lifted, or the water has made its quiet decision, the whole village does something very medieval and very familiar. It waits for a follow-up appointment. The noise fades. The crowd becomes chores again. And the body, always inconveniently physical, gets wrapped up like a small administrative problem that needs 3 days to finish loading. This is the part that feels strangely like paperwork. Except the paperwork is a hand, or an arm, or whatever the ritual had to borrow for a moment. A clerk, or a priest, or some local official with the talent of looking serious at a bandage. begins to treat time itself as evidence. Day 1 is for sealing and swearing not to peek. Day 2 is for pretending you are not thinking about it every 5 minutes. Day 3 is for opening the wrapping in light that tries, politely, not to take sides. If you're still awake while we discuss the thrilling suspense of scheduling the bandage inspection, you can subscribe. Or don't. Medieval clerks managed without likes, and they still found ways to be exhausted. When the day arrives, it arrives with a small ceremony of ordinary motions. Water is fetched. Cloth is laid out. Someone says a prayer that sounds like it has been used many times before, because it has. The bandage is unwound slowly, not because anyone is feeling poetic, but because sticking fabric can be stubborn, and stubbornness is the true background music of history. Everyone leans in with the careful focus of people trying not to look like they're leaning in. Then comes the reading, and it is a reading in the most literal sense: swelling, color, smell, dryness, dampness, warmth. The vocabulary of judgment becomes oddly domestic. Clean is a word that does heavy work here. Clean does not mean pretty. Clean means this is closing up in a way that lets us tell ourselves a story. Angry flesh, an old phrase with a tired, practical tone, means the body is still arguing with what happened. And the argument is now being used as a legal opinion. It's not quite medicine, but it isn't only superstition either. It's a meeting point where people use whatever tools they have. They know that wounds change. They know that worse looking often means trouble. They know that bandages can hide things, and that waiting can reveal them. And they build a rule around that knowledge, then dress it in prayer so it sounds official enough to hold a community still. Clerk might record the outcome in a register that has the emotional range of a bucket: names, dates, the charge, the ordeal performed, the result observed. And the observation is phrased very carefully because no one wants to write "God said so" in quite those words. The verdict becomes something like weather reporting: clear, cloudy, improving, worsening. God is spared from being quoted directly, which is considerate and also convenient, like leaving a boss off the email thread while still implying the boss agrees. There are small, sleepy details that matter too. Who is present? Whether the seals on the wrapping were intact. Whether the person carrying the bandage looked too eager, which is never a good sign in any century. Whether a local healer muttered something about herbs and was ignored politely. Whether someone tried to help by suggesting a different interpretation, the way people suggest you restart your router when your problem is clearly not the router. And in all of this, mercy and law sit side by side like two relatives who don't quite get along but are forced to share a bench. A clean healing can mean innocence, and innocence can mean peace, or at least the end of public attention, which is a kind of peace. A bad healing can mean guilt, and guilt can mean fines, exile, or other penalties that sound less like righteous fury and more like the village trying to tidy itself up. It's worth noticing softly how the community handles uncertainty by turning it into a timetable. 3 days, not 2, not 8. 3 is just enough time for a body to show a trend. 3 is also a number that feels holy, which helps everyone sleep at night. If you've ever refreshed a tracking page and decided the package is basically here, you understand the logic. The mind craves an update. The system provides one. The clerk writes it down, and everyone pretends that writing makes it steadier. Asterisk, asterisk. Sometimes the result is clean, and everyone exhales in the particular way people exhale when a complicated social problem is allowed to become simple again. Sometimes it is not clean, and the exhale is replaced by a murmuring that tries to sound like justice rather than curiosity. Either way, the ordeal's final act is quiet, cloth, light, eyes. and a few sentences that decide how tomorrow will look. And then, once the bandage is rewrapped or not, the world drifts onward. Animals need feeding. Fires need tending. Bread needs time. The clerk closes the book, because even divine judgment, it turns out, has office hours. The day settles back into its ordinary shape, and the proof, whatever it was, folds itself into the long, drowsy memory of the town, where most things end up sooner or later. You might not expect a town's entire sense of reality to depend on a rope that squeaks a little when it's damp, but it often did. A bell hangs up in timber and dust, and somehow that becomes a schedule. Hemp fibers decide when bread is baked, when gates are shut, when people pretend they will go to bed on time, and when they admit they have already been awake for hours. Embers pulse in a brazier beneath a small iron hook. A bell rope creaks in the dark like an old habit. Somewhere nearby, a handbell counts breaths between heartbeats, patiently, like it has nowhere else to be. Whisper, where and what time are you listening from? Before any ringing happens, there is the gentle, unglamorous work of getting ready to ring anything at all. The bell is not really the main character, even though it gets all the attention. The rope is the one doing the daily labor, and the rope is mostly plant matter that once grew in a field and is now expected to behave like a reliable piece of law. Hemp is soaked, twisted, stretched, and combed into something that looks simple until you try to replace it in winter with cold fingers. Sometimes the rope is thick where hands grip it the most, bulging slightly with extra wraps, because medieval timekeeping is also medieval ergonomics dot up in the belfry. The wood has its own opinions. Beams swell and shrink. Pegs loosen. Dust collects in corners and stays there long enough to earn a small pension. Spiders take civic pride in their work and hang their own delicate lines beside the heavy one. The bell itself, if it is old, has a voice people recognize the way you recognize a kettle by its whistle. Some bells even have names, which is a bit like naming your microwave, except the microwave is also the town's calendar and occasionally a warning system. There are rules, too, because time loves rules. A priest or a church warden might insist on which bell is used for which purpose and when. One bell for calling people to worship, one for funerals, one for alarms, sometimes one just for reminding everyone that the day is sliding along, whether they are ready or not. In some places, the curfew bell tells you to bank your fire and stop wandering. The word curfew is from couvre-feu, cover the fire, which sounds cozy until you realize it's also about discipline. Even warmth, it turns out, can be regulated. Someone keeps records, because someone always does. It might be a parish clerk with a careful hand and a fondness for ink that goes slightly brown over time. The clerk writes down payments for wax, for repairs, for a new rope, for a ladder that is not new but is now officially new because it has been moved and blessed by paperwork. A bell can crack, and bell metal is not cheap. Bell metal is usually a kind of bronze, and people argue quietly about the right mix the way people now argue about the right phone charger. Too much tin, and it may be brittle. Too little, and it may sound dull. The end user, meaning the whole town, mostly just wants it to ring without embarrassment. If you're still awake while we discuss the thrilling financial category of bell repairs and incidental rope, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Medieval people survived without notifications, though they did invent a very loud bronze one that went off whether you liked it or not. Once the rope is ready and the schedule is agreed upon, the ringing itself begins to look like something inevitable, like sunrise. But it isn't inevitable. It is practice labor. Bell ringers, sometimes hired, sometimes volunteers, sometimes the same people who do other chores, learn a rhythm that is half muscle memory, half listening. The rope moves through hands, and the bell swings or is struck depending on the style. In some places, the bell is rocked. In others, it is full circle ringing, which is a dramatic phrase for something that becomes, after enough repetition, just another Tuesday. The sound travels in ways that are both predictable and slightly mysterious. It slides along stone walls. It bounces off wet roofs and tries to enter every window. It finds the one person who is hoping to sleep late and politely refuses to cooperate. In summer, it can feel bright. In winter, it can feel sharp. And in fog, it becomes softer, as if the world is wearing a scarf. Different rings mean different things, and people learn them the way you learn which beep means your oven is hot and which beep means it is angry. A slow toll might mean death. A quick peal might mean celebration. A particular pattern might mean fire or invasion, or simply come here now because authority wants to see a crowd. There are bells called storm bells or alarm bells, and their job is to make sure no one can pretend they didn't hear. It is difficult to ghost a bell. Asterisk, the details get almost tenderly unnecessary. On certain days, the bell might ring at specific hours prime. Terce, sex, non, vespers, depending on local custom and how closely the community follows liturgical time. These hours are not always the same length because medieval hours can stretch with daylight and shrink with darkness. Imagine a calendar app that quietly changes the length of an hour because the sun feels like it. That is one way medieval time can behave, and everyone simply adjusts their expectations and keeps kneading their dough. Sometimes, the bell is rung by hand in a small way. A handbell in a street, a quieter sound for processions or notices. Sometimes the bell is rung with enough enthusiasm to be described later as too much. Because yes, there are complaints. People complain about ringing. They complain it's too early, too late, too long, too loud, not loud enough, and frankly a bit smug. Even in a world without social media, the comment section exists. It just happens in doorways. There are also little superstitions that sit on the edge of practical life. Those are sometimes baptized, blessed with holy water, given godparents in a ceremony that makes the bell feel like a member of the community rather than a tool. People believe bells can ward off storms or demons, or at least the general mood of bad luck. The bell becomes a kind of loud prayer you can pull on a rope. And if that sounds odd, it's only because we are used to silent prayers and vibrating phones. The medieval preference was for something you could hear from a field. After the ring has done its work, the day continues and the authorities have to decide what counts as proof that the ringing was correct. This is where the sleepy bureaucracy comes in, with its tidy love of observation. There are rules about who is allowed to ring, especially when ringers are paid. There are rules about what is rung for whom. There are rules about whether you can ring extra for your cousin's funeral because your cousin was quite beloved, which is the kind of claim that needs civic verification in some places. Payments can be small and strangely specific. A ringer might be paid in coins or in bread or in ale. Ale is never just ale. It is sometimes a wage with froth. In accounts, you might find a line that says, essentially, paid the bell ringers, and then lists amounts as if the sound itself had a price per minute. And in a way it does. The bell wears down ropes. It wears down hands. It wears down the patience of people who live right next to the church and have no choice but to become intimate with bronze. Clerks write down the expenses with a calm that implies the cost of time is normal. Candles for services, wax for sealing documents, a new pulley, nails, a carpenter's hours. Sometimes, scandalously, for mending the bell frame, which suggests the bell was trying to become a falling object, and the town preferred not to be surprised by that. If the bell is a civic bell as well as a church bell, some towns have both church and municipal authorities involved, then the bell can become a symbol of power. Whoever controls the bell controls attention. Whoever controls attention can make announcements feel official. It gets more detailed. Because history loves detail when it doesn't know what else to do. Some towns have fines for improper ringing. Ringing at the wrong time can be taken as disorder or disrespect, or simply annoying. There are also disputes about who has the right to ring the bell at all. A monastery might ring differently than a parish. A guild might want to ring for a procession. A city council might want to ring that sounds more urban. It's all very close to modern. Arguments about whose calendar invite is the real one. And then there's the gentle phenomenon of the bell being used to mark things that are not spiritual at all. Market times, opening and closing of gates, work hours, curfews. The bell becomes a public clock before clocks are common, or before people trust clocks, or before anyone agrees on what time is anyway. It is hard to argue with a sound that fills the air. It is persuasive. It has shape. It makes your day feel like it has chapters, even if the chapters are mostly about being told to show up. The legal side of it stays wonderfully indirect. The bell does not prove guilt or innocence, but it proves procedures were followed. The bell rings, therefore the meeting was called. The bell rings, therefore the gates are closing. The bell rings, therefore the town is warned, and warning matters, because later someone might say, "I did not know," and the bell will be offered as a witness. The bell, like an old friend, cannot speak in words, but it can testify in volume. Eventually, like all systems, it adjusts. And the adjustment is not dramatic. It is a slow shift, like furniture being moved a few inches each year until you are not sure where the room began. Mechanical clocks begin to appear in towns big. Public clocks with faces, hands, and complicated insides that need to be fed with maintenance and money. These clocks do not replace bells. They often recruit bells. A bell can be attached to a hammer, and the clock can strike hours without human hands pulling rope. This is progress, and also the beginning of the bell ringer's quiet anxiety about automation. At first, clocks are not necessarily accurate in the way we mean accurate. They drift. They need adjustment. Someone has to decide what true time is, and true time is often based on the sun, which is cheerful but not always cooperative. So the clock becomes another authority that needs authority. A town might hire a clock keeper, or a keeper might simply become the person who is always blamed for it being late. If you have ever blamed your phone for being wrong when you were the one who read it wrong, you understand the emotional dynamics. Asterisk. Councils start to restrict certain blessings and customs, and not just because they are trying to be strict. Europe changes. Legal systems grow more formal. Trials begin to rely more on interrogations, documents, juries, and other methods that are quieter and involve more sitting. The bell is still there, but it is asked to ring for different reasons. It rings to call jurors. It rings to announce sessions. It rings to mark the hour in a way that sounds less like heaven and more like municipal scheduling. In some places, the meaning of rings is standardized. In other places, it remains local. You can travel from one town to another and hear the same metal doing slightly different jobs. Like a person who has the same name but answers to different nicknames depending on the street. The bell's voice remains familiar, but its social role evolves. Sometimes people miss the old patterns. Sometimes they embrace the new ones because new patterns feel clean, even when they are only clean on paper, and still there are repairs. There are always repairs. Clocks need gears. Bells need ropes. Rope fibers fray. Iron rusts. Wood creaks. The belfry gathers more dust. Someone climbs up with a lantern and mutters about the cold. Someone writes an expense into a ledger and pretends they are not tired. There is no grand finale to any of this. The bell simply persists because it is easier to keep an old system humming than to invent a new one from scratch. If you listen closely, this is what history often sounds like: maintenance. A town's time is made out of repetition, of practices that feel ordinary until you realize they once felt new, once required argument, once required someone to make a decision and then have the decision ring out across wet roofs. And in the end, the bell does what it always does. It turns invisible agreements into audible reality. It tells you gently or firmly that the day is moving along. It reminds you that people once outsourced their sense of time to bronze and rope, and somehow it worked well enough to bake bread, hold meetings, and take long. Slow breaths between one ringing and the next dot, so keep facts in one jar rope length, bell metal, paid ringers, accounts in brown ink, and keep the feeling in another lighter jar, the one that says a sound can organize a life without needing to explain itself. Assume procedure is a kind of prayer, and prayer is often a schedule with candles. Change one small belief tomorrow about what time is supposed to feel like, and let the bell be a little less urgent in your mind. The rope creaks, the wood settles, the town sleeps, and the sound, for once, can fade without needing to conclude anything at all. Asterisk. Asterisk. You might assume a ritual that decides guilt with fire or water would end with a bang, or at least a memorable argument, but it often ends the way many medieval things end, with a quiet rule, written down, carried away, and slowly obeyed by tired people who would like fewer surprises before breakfast dot after enough ordeals. The most dramatic thing left is the paperwork. The priest's hands, which once hovered near a bowl of water or heated iron with the careful seriousness of someone lending out a key, begin to hover instead over a buck. Not because the priest has become less spiritual, but because the world has become more administrative. Parchment learns to carry more weight than steam, and ink begins to look like a gentler kind of authority. It is a strange trade, really, exchanging the certainty of a burn for the uncertainty of a sentence. But uncertainty has its own sleepy appeal. It stretches. It creates committees. If you're still awake while we watch medieval Europe slowly discover the joys of procedure, you can subscribe. Or don't. The bell of history rings either way, and it tends to ring at inconvenient times. Councils start to restrict blessings, and by restrict, they mean make smaller, like folding a large cloth into a neat square you can store. Over time, fewer officials want to stand too close to ordeals, because standing close makes you responsible for what happens next. And responsibility, like a damp cloak, is heavy. There is a line that begins to be drawn between the sacred and the judicial, not as a clean cut, but as a gradual shuffling of chairs in a room. The chair that used to sit beside the fire gets moved nearer to the table. A table appears that did not exist before. The table acquires documents. The documents acquire seals. The seals acquire that calm, smug confidence only wax can manage. That doesn't happen in one day. It never does. One village still trusts the old way because the old way is what they know, and what they know feels safer than what they do not. Another village hears rumors that the ordeal is being questioned. Rumors travel softly at first, carried by merchants and monks, by travelers who are good at talking and not so good at being precise. Someone says, "They don't do it like that over there anymore." Someone else says, "Of course they do, they just do it quietly." And then a third person says, "Maybe they never did." This is the early medieval version of reading 3 different articles online and becoming vaguely tired. Meanwhile, kings begin to prefer juries, and by prefer, we mean find it useful. A jury can be managed in ways that fire and water cannot. A jury can be summoned. A jury can be delayed. A jury can be scolded. A jury can be persuaded, or at least gently steered, like a cart that needs to go around a pothole. Fire has no interest in persuasion. Water does not respond to policy. They simply do what they do. And rulers, like sleepy managers everywhere, tend to favor systems that can be scheduled out, so the ordeal becomes thinner at the edges. It stops being the first choice. It becomes the second choice, then the third, then the thing that old people mention when they are describing how serious the past was. It is still there, but it is less central, like an old tool hanging on a wall that no one quite wants to throw away because it might be useful. And because throwing it away would feel like admitting something about progress dot in towns where ordeals once had a place, the physical objects remain. A cauldron does not vanish simply because the law has updated its preferences. The cauldron might be repurposed. It might become a vessel for dyeing cloth, which is a much calmer occupation. Instead of deciding whether someone is clean before God, it decides whether wool is blue enough to impress a neighbor. People keep using it because metal is expensive and memory is practical. And because daily life needs containers more than it needs spectacles. The pool too forgets. Or rather, the people around it forget first, and then the pool is allowed to be only a pool. It returns to being an ordinary shadowy surface that reflects trees and clouds, rather than reflecting a verdict. The rope that once circled waists might still exist somewhere, but now it circles barrels, or it keeps a gate shut, or it becomes a line for drying laundry that flaps like a board flag. It turns out rope prefers this kind of quiet work. This change is sometimes called progress, and sometimes called weakness, and sometimes called mercy, and sometimes called, finally, we can stop doing that. The vocabulary depends on who is speaking and what happened to them in the previous decade. But the habit underneath is the same. The habit of letting elements decide begins to shift into the habit of letting people decide. And people, unlike water, have opinions. People also have lunch breaks. The legal world, as it grows more formal, begins to develop a love for counting. Not counting souls, exactly, but counting statements, counting days, counting witnesses, counting the number of times a document is folded. A trial becomes less like an event and more like a process you can return to. You can pause it. You can resume it. You can ask for something in writing. That last one is especially important because writing can travel farther than a priest can, and it can survive longer than a memory can, and it does not get cold in winter in quite the same way. And yet, even as ordeals fade, the memory of them has a lingering warmth, like embers after the fire is banked. People continue to talk about them in the way people talk about extreme weather, as something that happened, something you survived, something you can describe with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Yes, someone might say, they used to do that, and the person listening might nod slowly, half amused, half horrified, and then immediately get distracted by the more pressing question of where their shoes are. Sometimes, instead of an ordeal, a community chooses substitutes that are softer, but still satisfy the same desire for a clear end. Oaths become more important. Witnesses, too. A person who can gather oath helpers, people willing to swear to their reliability, can sometimes cross a bridge that fire would have demanded a toll for. It's not necessarily fair. It's just different. It leans toward social networks rather than physical elements, which is, in its own quiet way, a very modern shift. If you have friends, the system feels kinder. If you don't, the system feels like a locked door that insists it is open. Champions appear in some places, turning judgment into athletics with prayers at the corners. This too can be framed as progress because it is less mystical and more predictable, in the sense that human muscles follow human limits. But it still has the same basic wish beneath it, that something visible will settle what words cannot. The medieval mind, when it is tired, likes a simple ending. It likes a sign. It likes a verdict that feels like it arrived from outside the messy swirl of rumors. And then there are the quiet exits. Not every case becomes a public performance. Often, people find other doors as the old framework loosens. Charters, alms, letters, payments, apologies that are formal enough to be accepted and vague enough to be survivable. Settlements arrive as silver and silence, written small and folded twice. The folding matters, not because paper loves being folded, but because folded documents feel secret and safe. A folded document feels like a promise you can put in your pocket. This is the gentle truth about legal history. It is not a straight line toward justice. It is a long drift toward systems that can be repeated. And repetition is what makes a community feel stable, even when the repetition is imperfect. A ritual ordeal is a repetition. A jury is a repetition. A document is a repetition. A seal is a repetition that leaves a mark. People choose the form of repetition that best matches their current anxieties and their current resources, and they call that choice wisdom. The priest stepping back is not always a dramatic refusal. Often it is simply a change in role. The priest still blesses, still prays, still presides over the moral atmosphere, but the direct handling of verdicts becomes someone else's responsibility. That responsibility is taken up by officials, by councils, by courts, by scribes who know how to sharpen quills and keep their handwriting consistent. The scribes become the new caretakers of outcomes, and their rituals quieter: ink, sand, wax, folded parchment, a careful listing of names. A list of names is a kind of spell, if you think about it, because it makes people real in a system. And in this quieter world, time behaves differently. An ordeal happens in a moment, but a legal case can stretch. It can occupy weeks. It can return like a recurring dream. People can be summoned, released, summoned again. A verdict can be postponed. Postponement becomes a tool which is both frustrating and strangely soothing. It means you do not have to decide today. It means the future is still holding the decision for you. Like a jar with a lid. So the town keeps its objects but changes their meaning. The embers dim. The water settles. The bell sleeps. The rope, if it is still there, creaks for reasons that have nothing to do with guilt. The judge still names charges. The people still whisper, but they whisper about different things now, about who knows whom, about who wrote what, about whether a witness can be trusted, about whether someone's cousin is on the jury, about whether the scribe spelled the name correctly, which is somehow a serious matter, and maybe that is the soft lesson in all of this. When you stop letting elements decide, you do not stop needing faith. You just move faith into other containers. You begin to believe in procedure. You begin to believe that counting is meaningful. You begin to believe that words can hold truth if they are written carefully enough, sealed properly enough, stored safely enough. It is not less mystical. It is simply a different kind of mysticism, one made of paper rather than fire, of schedules rather than smoke. Asterisk. So when you picture the priest stepping back, picture it gently. Picture a small pause. A hand that used to bless heat now blesses an hour instead. A voice that used to speak over water now speaks over a page. The village still breathes in 4 and out 6 because breathing is one ritual that never needs a council to approve it. And the world, for all its talk of progress, keeps doing what it always does. It trades one certainty for another and calls the trade reasonable. Keep facts in one jar: iron, rope, seals, days counted on knuckles, names written in careful lines, and keep the softer thing in another jar. The one that holds how a community tries to feel safe. Assume that fear has always been practical. Assume that mercy often arrives disguised as bureaucracy. And if your mind is still awake enough to notice the change, let it notice it slowly, the way a candle flame leans when a door opens. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to remind you that the air keeps moving, that history keeps shifting its furniture, and that judgment, for once, can wait its turn. Embers pulse in a hearth that has seen too many winter mornings. A rope creaks over a dark pool, not dramatically, just the way rope reminds you it is rope. Somewhere nearby, a handbell counts breaths between heartbeats, because if you can count a breath, you can pretend you're in charge of what comes next. And very softly, as if it's none of anyone's business, you might ask yourself, where and what time are you listening from Dot? It's a strange comfort, in a medieval kind of way, to imagine that guilt can be answered like a question on a form. Not why did you do it, not what happened to your childhood, just a simpler request. Please select one, fire or water. The judge names the charge in the plainest words available. The priest names the element with the unhurried tone of someone introducing an honored guest. The crowd names the story before it begins, because crowds are excellent at pre-writing conclusions, and because boredom always looks for a hobby. If you are accused of something in a village that runs on wheat, worry, and memory, the choice of Ordeal might not feel like a choice at all. Fire, in some places, suits theft and secret taking, the kind of crime that lives in pockets and shadows. Water, in some places, answers whispers of hidden pacts, because water seems honest, and also because no one wants to admit they made the rules up on a windy Tuesday. Season matters. Status matters. Rumor matters. Even the local talent for exaggeration matters. And while you stand there trying to look like a person who is not about to be evaluated by physics, you learn a new kind of breathing. In 4 out 6. Slow enough to keep the mind from sprinting, slow enough to make minutes feel wide. The preparation is, in its own way, the most medieval part. Tools are washed in words first and actual water second, because words are cheaper and they make people feel organized. A psalm gives edges to the hour. Candles mark the door, the path, the line where witnesses must stop pretending to be judges and start being witnesses again, which is a smaller role but still comes with opinions. The priest may fast from advice and food, as if hunger can make the blessing sharper. Heat is blessed like it's being politely borrowed. Depth is blessed like it's a heavy blanket being folded. Someone sets aside a chord, a measure, and a list of names. Because if the universe is about to speak, the universe should at least sign in. There is always a surprising amount of measuring for something that claims to be divine. Distance is counted in paces that are meant to be standard, which is a funny word in a world where the concept of standard is mostly a rumor. The iron is weighed, or at least described as if it has a weight everyone agrees on. The water is described as cold or boiling with the confidence of people who have not yet invented the thermometer but still enjoy certainty. It's almost like a bedtime routine, if your bedtime routine included public officials. Wash, bless, count, repeat, adjust the candle, recount, calm the mind. Pretend the system is calm to Dot, and then, very quietly, fire begins to behave like fire. The iron waits in coals until it glows the color of an answer no one wants. It is carried in a hand, or balanced in a cloth, or lifted with something that claims to be a tool but looks suspiciously like improvisation. Sometimes it is a bar, sometimes a wedge, sometimes a ring taken from hot water as if the water is offering a confession. The accused carries it 3 measured paces, because 3 is a number that sounds old and serious, and because a longer walk would feel like tempting fate with extra steps. The crowd watches with the attention people reserve for anything that is both rare and slightly awful, like a comment or a neighbor's argument. Asterisk afterward, the real star of the evening arrives, the bandage. The hand is wrapped, not with tender affection, but with careful procedure. The wrapping is sealed with wax and thread, as if the wound might try to edit itself while no one is looking. And then everyone waits. The waiting is important. The waiting is almost the point. On the third day, the bandage is opened in light that catches no dust if it can help it. And the clerks look for swelling, color, smell, and whatever else the human body offers when it has been asked to take part in a legal debate. A wound that heals clean can mean peace and paid off. An angry wound can mean a fine, an exile, or a harsher road. The verdict is phrased as observation, not opinion, so that God is spared from being quoted too directly, which is frankly considerate. Water has its own slow choreography. A rope circles the waist with the practical snugness of something that has hauled barrels and closed gates long before it ever had legal ambitions. The knot remembers where truth should rest, or at least it pretends to. The pool is blessed against trickery, which is an optimistic gesture because pools are not famous for listening. Then the accused is lowered or thrown, or guided in with the dignity the local crowd can manage, and the water does what water does. The logic, sinking means accepted, floating means rejected, has a dreamy, upside-down quality, like a sentence you hear half asleep and only realize later makes no sense. But sense is not the product being sold here. Certainty is. The strangest part is how quickly the ritual tries to become normal again. Hands that haul you out become witnesses twice over, to breath returning and to what the water said. People cough. Someone adjusts their cloak. Someone pretends they weren't just holding their breath too, as if breath could influence a verdict by sympathy. And then the village goes back to being a village. Pots still need scrubbing. Animals still need feeding. The pool, despite its moment of fame, is still mostly a pool. That sense of returning of the extraordinary being folded back into the ordinary is one of the softest things about the ordeal. It is dramatic, yes, but it is also scheduled. If you're still awake at this point, you deserve a small medieval prize like an apple or a mildly sincere nod. You can also subscribe if you want, or don't. Medieval clerks didn't ask for likes, but they did ask for seals. And that was probably worse dot as the system repeats itself. It starts to develop an afterlife of paperwork. Clerks write down names with faces that give nothing away, because neutrality is a costume you can wear even if you don't own many clothes. Dates are recorded carefully because the third day matters, and because 3 days later is the kind of detail that makes a story feel official. The court learns to read wounds like it reads days, slowly with squinting, with a kind of practiced seriousness that looks a bit like boredom. And boredom, in law, can be powerful. It makes people consistent. It makes them less likely to improvise. It makes them favor procedure over spectacle, which is, depending on your personality, either progress or tragedy. Of course, not everyone wants to let their skin or lungs do their arguing. So substitutes appear soft and human and, in their own way, tedious. Some bring oath helpers instead of iron. Others offer arrangements in silver. Some cases drift into charters and letters because a letter can move faster than a cauldron. Champions appear in some traditions, turning judgment into athletics with prayers of the coroners, which is a strange compromise. If we can't let God decide through water, perhaps God will decide through someone's stamina. And when both sides tire, because people do tire, and paperwork takes time, settlement arrives as money and silence, written small and folded twice, over time. The priest steps back, not with a dramatic speech, but with a quiet change in habit. Councils restrict blessings. Kings prefer juries. Ordeals then to border villages and stubborn lords, then to stories told by winter bread, then to memories that make the past sound tougher than the present. Parchment learns to carry more weight than steam. The habit of letting elements decide becomes the habit of counting sworn words instead. The town keeps the cauldron for dyeing cloth. The pool forgets. People say this is progress, and then they ask who's on the jury, which is the ancient version of checking who controls the group chat dot and still. The old rhythm lingers because humans love rituals that feel like they tidy reality. Even when the ordeal fades, the desire for a clear, visible end remains. So the new world creates its own calm ceremonies, reading depositions, sealing documents, scheduling hearings, counting witnesses, postponing decisions in a way that feels responsible rather than avoidant. Postponement becomes a tool. A tool is comforting. It means you don't have to decide today. It means the future is holding the verdict for you, like a jar with a lid dot, so before sleep, you can make a small oath of your own, one that doesn't involve fire or water, just attention. Keep facts in one jar: iron, rope, seals, third day, rumor, rank, season. Keep the softer thing in another jar, the way fear looks when it tries to sound official. The way mercy sometimes arrives disguised as procedure. The way a village can turn anything into a rule if it repeats it long enough. Change one small belief tomorrow. Not quickly, not loudly, about mercy, about proof. About how certainty often borrows its voice from whatever is nearest. Whether it's a priest's blessing or a clerk's ink, the embers dim in the hearth. The water settles in the pool. The bell sleeps between breaths. And judgment, for once, waits its turn, patient as parchment, quiet as wax. As if it could keep waiting and waiting and waiting, while you drift slowly, gently out of 4 and into 6.